There's a reason every serious study of the First World War eventually circles back to the trenches. Not because they're iconic, but because they were the single most important survival tool on the Western Front. And before you think of trenches as primitive ditches carved out by tired soldiers with rusty shovels, understand this. Trench digging during the First World War was a precise engineering discipline. It blended geology, physics, human endurance, and battlefield strategy into one of the most impactful, life-saving systems of the war. For the next few minutes, I want to walk you through how the trenches were actually designed, why their construction mattered far more than most people realize, and what lessons modern survivalists and military historians alike can pull from the engineering that shaped a generation of warfare. When you look closely, the story of trenches isn't just about mud and misery. It's about the fight to stay alive long enough to fight another day. Soldiers didn't dig for comfort. They dug because the ground was the only thing standing between them and machine guns capable of cutting down entire companies in seconds. The hook is this. Trench engineering wasn't just a tactic. It was a life-preservation art form refined under constant fire. And once you understand the logic behind it, you see the war in an entirely different light. The reason trench digging mattered so much was simple. The industrialization of warfare had outpaced the mobility of armies. Artillery outranged movement, automatic weapons outperformed bravery, and commanders were forced to adapt the hard way. So engineers and soldiers took to the earth. Digging a trench was the one measure that reliably reduced casualties in a world where stepping into the open meant death. This wasn't random improvisation. The British, French and Germans all developed manuals, trench schools and dedicated engineering units whose sole job was to refine the process. Each army treated the ground as both a shield and an obstacle, and the difference between a well-built trench and a rushed one was the difference between surviving a bombardment or being buried in it. Trench construction followed order and purpose. First came the shallow scrape, essentially a temporary firing position that troops dug while under fire. Once secure, this expanded into a proper trench with a depth of about 7 to 8 feet, just enough to protect a standing soldier from rifle and machine gun fire. The walls were reinforced with sandbags, wooden boards, woven hurdles, or whatever materials were at hand. This prevented collapse, especially in wet soil, where a single rainfall could turn solid earth into pudding. The trench floor was laid with duckboards to prevent trench foot, a lesson learned after thousands of men had already suffered from the rot caused by standing in cold water for hours. One of the most overlooked aspects of trench digging is, quite frankly, drainage. Engineers, you see, studied the slope of the land, the water table, and natural runoff patterns. Why? Because, well, a flooded trench was worse than no trench at all. If you've ever built a practical defensive position or even managed a campsite in wet ground, you already know that controlling water is the first rule of long-term survival. Now, WWI engineers understood this on a battlefield scale. They cut sumps into the floor to collect water, installed pumps when available, and designed trenches with gentle gradients to keep water moving rather than pooling. This attention to detail, it saved both feet and lives, truly. Now, the famous zigzag pattern of trenches wasn't stylistic. It was calculated, you see. Straight trenches meant that a single enemy shell could kill dozens from the blast travelling unbroken along the line. But zigzags, they broke that lethal corridor, limiting destruction to just one short section. They also prevented enemy soldiers from firing down the entire length if they managed to breach the line. This principle, well, it's still useful today. Whether you're designing a defensive layout, a bunker system, or even a fire break, compartmentalization prevents local damage from turning into total disaster. It's, the same idea behind watertight compartments on modern ships. Frontline trenches were only one piece of a deeper system. Behind them lay support trenches, communication trenches, and reserve positions, all connected like arteries feeding and protecting the front. This allowed rotations, supply movement and casualty evacuation, even during intense shelling. If you've ever studied emergency egress routes or designed a fallback plan for a survival scenario, you can appreciate how brilliant this system truly was. No position existed in isolation. Everything was designed with options built in, a concept every survivalist should adopt. Understanding this art of trench digging gives you insight into how engineering becomes strategy. For example, if you were applying WWI trench building logic to a modern survival scenario, you would start by reading the terrain the same way military engineers did. You'd identify high ground for observation, low ground to avoid due to water saturation, and natural cover to minimize exposure. You dig only as deep as necessary for safety, reinforce your walls with whatever materials you have, create drainage channels to maintain long-term usability, and build your system with angles or bends to limit blast effects if something went wrong. You would also design fail-safe routes because fixed positions without redundancy become death traps when conditions change. The art of trench digging during WWI. How engineering saved lives wasn't just a wartime necessity. It was a practical demonstration of how adaptability, observation, and craftsmanship can determine survival in extreme conditions. When you study the trenches, you study the silent engineering that kept millions alive long enough to see another sunrise in a war defined by steel and fire. If you found this breakdown valuable and want more deep dive battlefield engineering and survival history, make sure to subscribe, share this video with fellow history buffs, and help grow a community of people who take the past seriously enough to learn from it.